If a person is threatened to be cut from ear to ear with a razor blade, and that person then steps back and shoots 6 times, including in the back, is that person entitled to a justification charge, self-defense? To find out, you have to read People versus Castillo, but it's 7 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases and I try to do it in 5 minutes or less. This is the episode on the case of People versus Castillo. The citation for this case is 2024 New York Slip Opinion 05817, published by the New York Court of Appeals on November 21st of 2024. The issue in this case is when lethal self-defense is justified in a criminal case. To understand and appreciate the context of this case, the background that's helpful to know is that under criminal procedural law and the penal law, there is a concept called self-defense. In New York, we call it justification. And penal law section 35.15 talks about and defines the defense of justification. It says that a person may use physical force to defend himself against an assailant's imminent use of unlawful physical force, but it does not authorize the use of deadly physical force unless the person believes that the assailant is about to use deadly physical force upon them or somebody else. That justification definition has 2 parts. If you listen to it closely, there's 2 parts to it. Part 1 is that it's a subjective and an objective requirement. So part 1 is subjectively, does the defendant, him or herself, actually believe that he or she was threatened with the imminent use of deadly physical force? So is there a subjective belief? And the second part is the objective part. Are the defendant's reactions those of a reasonable man or woman acting in self-defense? So if a person objectively believes it, if a person subjectively believes it and it's objectively true, then you can have the defense of justification, which is self-defense. When a judge considers whether to give a specific defense charge or any kind of charge in a criminal case, the judge has to consider whether, viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the defendant, there's any reasonable view of the evidence that the defendant is justified in his or her actions. Okay, that's the rule with regard to whether the defendant is entitled to get that justification charge upon request. So what are the facts in this case? The facts are that there's a barbershop in the Bronx where Julio Lebron allegedly had a series of fights and arguments with the owner, including a fist fight. He threatened to shoot the owner and his family, and then he left. He then came back later that day, and at that point, the owner of the barbershop texted his friend, who's the defendant here, Jairo Castillo, to come help him while this LeBron person was in the barbershop. When Castillo arrived, LeBron took out a small little blade, less than 2 inches, less than the size of a paperclip, according to the oral argument, and put the blade against Castillo's face and said he was going to cut him from ear to ear and that nobody was getting out of the barbershop. At that point, Castillo, the defendant here, took a step back more than 2 or 3 feet, allegedly, this is all allegedly, and took a gun out and shot at LeBron 6 times. After the first 2 shots, LeBron sort of turned around, got shot in the back a couple times, and ultimately died. And the question at trial, Castillo was charged with the murder, and he sought to invoke the defense of self-defense, justification. And he asked for the justification charge. The judge, at the charge conference, said, "I'm not going to give that charge because the victim was shot 6 times, including in the back. And there's no appropriate charge here. It's not a reasonable view of the evidence that the defendant was facing imminent threat of death or physical force like that because the victim had a small little blade and the defendant had a gun." The jury convicted Castillo of second-degree murder and second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. The defendant appealed, claiming that he was deprived of his defense because he never got that self-defense charge, justification charge that he asked for. The procedural history here is the appellate division affirmed the conviction, and it goes to they say there's no reasonable view of the evidence to suggest that Castillo was justified in firing the 4 additional shots in the victim's back, even if the initial gunshots had been justified. It then goes to the Court of Appeals, and here we have a reversal. The Court of Appeals reverses, and they say as a matter of law here, the defendant was entitled to that justification charge. Why? Because the victim was the initial aggressor. The defendant faced the imminent threat of deadly physical force at the time the victim held the blade against the defendant's face. The fact that the defendant stepped back does not mean that he could no longer have reasonably believed he was facing physical force. And given the rapidity, the quickness of the unfolding events, it was less than 30 seconds, the entire incident, less than 5 seconds, the actual shooting incident. The jurors could have reasonably concluded that the shots to the victim's back were justified because they could have reasonably believed that the assailant, the victim, still posed a threat to him. So in other words, the defendant could have subjectively feared imminent risk of harm, and that could have been objectively valid as well. And by depriving the jury of that jury charge, they didn't have a chance to even assess whether it applied or not. Conviction reversed, new trial ordered, and that's the case of People versus Castillo. Have a good day. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.